Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Building a Game-Based Learning Experience in the Classroom with iClicker, with Ray Villanueva, who's on camera there. Ray, if you want to give a wave. I will be introducing Ray in just a second, but I wanted to take care of some housekeeping items first. You all are muted upon entry. That's just to cut down on background noise, but we do want your feedback and your questions and your thoughts. So below your attendee panel, you'll see a questions panel and a chat panel. Feel free to use either of those to give us feedback, ask questions throughout the webinar. We will take all questions at the end of the webinar, so we'll go through anything that's piled up or any questions that you have at that point. I believe that's all for housekeeping, so I'm going to move on to the introduction of our presenter. Ray Villanueva, sorry about that, is a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas at San Antonio, currently teaching introduction level classes in the 4 subfields: archaeology, biological anthropology, cultural anthropology, and linguistics. Ray holds a BA in anthropology from UTSA and an MA in linguistics from the University of Virginia, where he taught ESOL classes at the Center for American English Language Culture. He is currently a doctoral student in anthropology at UTSA, studying the nuclear fuel cycle in the American Southwest. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Ray. Thank you so much for presenting for us today, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Lindsay. So as she said, this presentation is called Building a Game-Based Learning Experience in the Classroom with iClicker. And with this particular presentation, it's in part a continuation, in part a reversioning of a presentation I gave last year on gamification. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a few seconds, but the core of this presentation in my mind was last year I had been tinkering with iClicker a lot on how to actually build out a game, especially with this platform and how we can make it work. And then recently, I had been challenged to say, well, what's the point of using a game in the classroom? Is it being used to actually meet objectives, to learn more about the content, or is it just to have a game? And so with that, recently I learned about the difference between game-based learning and gamification, and where there might be a place for both in iClicker. That's not a criticism by any means, but it's about me thinking of how can I create smaller, more important games that actually further the understanding of students on particular topics. And so with this particular presentation, I will admit it's probably more cultural or social science based on, especially in the examples I'm going to give you. But I do think in general, these kind of ideas are applicable across the disciplines, although I haven't quite figured out the best way to get across them. So with every presentation I give, students or otherwise, I always like to give objectives. And so for this, I want to have 3 main objectives. One is to really compare what gamification means and to compare it to game-based learning. 2 is to discuss the ways to incorporate more games in the classroom. And finally, to describe some best practices for using iClicker for games beyond just wanting and having and needing a game in the first place. So with that being said, recently, or within the past year or so, there was a presentation from the University of Texas at Austin by Dr. Julie Shao. She was at the UTSA Provost Academy with a presentation on how to make games better in the classroom. And this was the first time that I actually understood that there's a difference between gamification and game-based learning. Now, especially in the education field, which is, I would admit I was unaware of, when they're talking about gamification, they tend to be talking about things like badges, experience points, or leaderboards. Ways that throughout the semester, through a number of assignments or so on, that students are able to track their progress and especially compare it. So according to Stephen Isaacs, gamification is a way of using learning mainly out of a textbook learning and lectures, but to build classes using game mechanics, such as badges, experience points, levels, and leaderboards to boost student engagement by allowing students to choose from quests and progress at their own pace through a series of educational activities. And when I discovered this, I realized there are some points, especially in my previous gamification lecture, where this kind of fits. when I read gamification, a lot of it's these kind of instant gratifications. You get a badge for something, you get experience points. But the key to it is that leaderboard for me, and that I realized for gamification in especially my field in anthropology, that it's all kind of talking about winning and competition. And I realized that there is definitely a place for that. I built out these like review games and using gamification with iClicker. I am proud of that, and I want to have winners to celebrate their success. But that doesn't necessarily get across better and greater content as we move on. And so in that time, I wanted to move from a gamification model in part to a game-based learning model, one that emphasizes learning experiences, motivating students, and more than anything else, to advancing objectives. And so all of this wraps up into this idea that game-based learning fundamentally relates to the use of games to enhance the learning experience. And so trying to go away from games for game's sake. We all need to have that class review at some point, but making a game of it just made it fun, which there's nothing wrong with that. But how do we build upon that to actually build games to be part of the learning experience? And how do we do it with iClicker? So I tend to have a wide variety of class sizes. I've literally gone from 7 students to about 180 in the past couple years. And so I have to keep scale in mind. And because of that, iClicker has always been a pivotal part on how I do things, because you don't want to change too much depending on which class you're doing. And so with that in mind, I was trying to think of how I can build out smaller games that are still meaningful and that still meet these objectives, but also can allow scale to actually be a thing. And so moving from gamification towards game-based learning, I realized that gamification, again, is all about competition, and its uses are fairly limited. But when we do game-based learning, it allows us to engage more ideas, more communication, more teamwork, and more critical thinking. It allows students in particular to engage in these larger ideas and actually learn something beyond just a review. And so with that in mind, I've been trying and sometimes failing at figuring out how I can incorporate these ideas. So with an approach towards game-based learning, I'm attempting in part to move away games for game's sake, those review games. Now, like I said, I love those games. This is not a bash on them. They are important and the students love them. However, I also want to build activities that enhance the learning experience and environment throughout the semester, and not just 1 or 2 or 3 times the semester before those big tests. So with that, I've begun to think about what can students do, what will they do, and how do we get that content across? And so this is one example of a recent activity of how I've tried to incorporate smaller games within the iClicker experience. And so in my intro to anthropology class, we literally at one point talked about what is a man. We try to identify words and ideas about what we identify with the word man. And I realized last semester, this is the perfect opportunity for a game. And so through iClicker, I have them do a short answer poll about what words that they can come up with. I encourage them to put as many as possible within about a 2-minute time period, and we end up with a beautiful word cloud like that using the results. Now, this is when I actually kind of make a game out of it. And when I say a game, I emphasize that I'm not looking to create something that has winners or losers in particular, but I'm looking for something that gets them to learn more in an activity, but where there's also teamwork and ideas going on. And so for this game, I had them explain why they chose similar words after finding students that use different words. So if one person put tall, another person put dude, those are the ones that I would want them paired together. Why did someone choose tall versus dude? and explain why they chose those words, and also see if they actually used any other words that were more similar. And to keep it going along iClicker to see that the participation is happening, I have them submit, well, what are some new words that they can use, that they would use to mean a man? This is where the kind of winner versus loser thing happens, what I enjoy, the students enjoy, but I don't quite know if it meets those objectives that I'm setting out. Because I have the class vote on which new word for man that they created. And their goal is to use it in a sentence, in a discussion, in a text within the next week. Now, by voting for choosing one new word for man, it kind of implicitly chooses a winner. But it doesn't mean it's a winner based off of most points. It means it's a winner because the students liked it. And I found in this particular activity, the students primarily chose it because it sounded, what they said was cool. And that, if someone said it, nobody would really question what they meant, which was, for them, what a word should be. So after doing this particular game, which took about 15 minutes, I had the students all go out. They all claimed that they were going to document their use of this new word. And I found that about 90% of them within a week actually used their new word. And I've also talked to some of these students since then and discovered they've actually added this new word to their lexicon, that they've actually been using it unironically and incorporating that when they talk to people about, a man. So in this idea of what a game could be, I had these students start off on iClicker. Then they actually had to go, move, find someone and talk to them. But all along, I'm having them tell me what's happening. What are the words that they agree on? What is the new word that they like? And then we do another multiple choice poll and identify which word do they like best to use. And I don't know if the students really loved it, but the ones that grafted onto this game, the fact that I know that they're actually using these words every day now, it's kind of amazing. And the fact is, it allowed them to critically think about what it means to be a man in our culture. It allows them to talk it through, and hopefully they learn something new and some words that they made up together. It's the perfect way for a game. Now, another example, and again, it's very words-based, is talking through this idea of Orientalism. So this came in an intro to cultural class that I'm teaching this semester. I quite literally did this on Friday. And so theoretically, this idea is, how do we talk about the Middle East, the Far East, the Near East? What do those mean? What kind of imagery and ideas do we come up with? And you can see from the word cloud on number one was that they, gave a lot of responses on what that could be when they think of the Middle East or the Far East. And so when I saw this word cloud, I realized this is the perfect chance for our game, because this is where we get to relate them to what their culture is, what their ideas are, and how do those get represented. And so after they submitted that first, what do they think about the East, I had them get in a group. And I gave them originally 3 minutes to find an example of each word from the movie Aladdin, from Disney's Aladdin. And so you can see from this word cloud, there are a bunch to choose from. And when I gave them a 3-minute time limit, they freaked out on me because they realized they needed 10, because they could use almost all of these words to describe the East using the movie Aladdin. And at that point, one, I'm happy. They're making these great connections in the classroom, they're building it out. But then they actually wanted to present. They wanted to prove how well they did, what kind of connections they made, when I made very clear that there was no prize involved. This literally wasn't a competition, but they wanted to present. They wanted to prove that they built out these connections. And so we spent a little bit longer than I intended, where the students actually went one by one for most of these words and identified them with the film, which was amazing. And the fact that they were able to connect these ideas of what we think about the East versus what we saw in the movie Aladdin, it was brilliant, and it made me so incredibly happy. And it was the perfect little game. And so when I was thinking about this, is a game the same thing as an activity? And for me, the answer is no. And one, it's because even though we're trying to move away from the sense of competition, students like to brag. They like to show off. It's just the way things work. And so even though I made very clear no one's going to win anything, there's no extra credit, there's no bonus points. It's just bragging rights. Even if I'm not promoting that, the students love the idea of demonstrating what they know and doing it in a particular frame. And so this does kind of edge on activity versus game. But for me, this is a game because even though they're not competing for a winner, they're competing for knowledge and they want to prove what they know. And that's the best way to go about things. And so I'm only including a couple of short examples on this for the fact that I've not built out a lot of ideas on how to make it the most effective. But I do have a sense on what works and what doesn't on building out these kind of practices. And so if you're building out some kind of activity or a game, whichever you prefer to call it, I recommend using iClicker to guide it through or to launch the game. It's not going to be the crux of it, and you might just see that early forms of participation, but it's not going to necessarily be throughout. The first step should always have the students working individually. This is your best chance to actually see if students are participating. We know once you put them in the group, there's going to be those groups that only one person speaks up, then the rest just don't care. And there's those groups that all of them might jockey for positions. So even if they're all submitting individually throughout the game, the fact that you start individually means you've got everyone's voice heard, and that even if there's one word that appears in the word cloud that no one else used, they can know that they were represented. And that's a huge part to knowing that they're part of this classroom and part of this community. After you've done that individuals, then you put them in groups. Now, I still recommend to keep things to 15 to 20 minutes for maximum student engagement. This isn't necessarily a perfect number by any means, but in general, we know by about the 20-minute mark, you lose any chance at students paying attention any longer. That being said, sometimes you need a little bit more. When I did the East and the Aladdin game, I only expected a 10-minute thing, and they wanted to take control of the entire class period, and we had enough time and space for allow that to happen. They wanted to take 30 minutes to prove every single link, when I just wanted to see how many they can make. So with that in mind, I recommend 15 to 20 minutes so that you have the maximum student engagement. That's why this presentation is going to be on the shorter side. But it's also about keeping people's engagement, keeping their ideas going, and then moving on. Because the game isn't supposed to be the entire day. It's not supposed to be the big event. It's supposed to be something that allows us to engage and understand the topics and the content just a little bit better. And I keep harping on this because I think it's the most important point to actually incorporating games throughout a class and throughout the semester is don't name a winner. Even if there's clearly someone who, that group that everyone chose the word that they made up, or there's a group that had just the most connections, don't actually call them the winner. Don't name them a winner. Don't give them any prizes. Because then, in my mind, it makes it a game about competition and not a game about learning. Oops. So a couple of last thoughts on this, and like I said, it's going to be on the shorter end, is when you're thinking about including games, creating games, using iClicker or otherwise in the classroom, think about what the exercise will add for students. If the point is just to have a game day, it doesn't quite take it to where we want it. The students can still learn from a great review game. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's not the goal of game-based learning for this objective. We want to be engaging in those theories, those concepts. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time, but the goal is that it's not just a game day. One thing that I've been especially proud of by doing this is that it really makes the readings feel alive or applicable. I just reviewed some class reflections after that assignment, and every student, for the most part, was raving about how many things they now see in the media about how we idealize the East. And so, with that being said, I was so proud that they were making these connections between the reading and a game about a movie. And finally, when everyone learns, everyone wins. So that's the crux of this presentation, and I'm around if you have any questions or thoughts. Otherwise, if you'd like to contact me, I love chatting about anything iClicker. Feel free to contact me at ray.villanueva@utsa.edu. I'm also voraciously on Twitter at AREYV, and feel free to check out my website on rayvillanueva.com.
Okay, thank you, Ray. I would love to take a few minutes for any questions if you folks have them. It's like one just came through. Let's get, oops. So I'm trying to get the panel open so I can see. Okay, we have a thank you from Eva Cunningham. Thank you, Eva. Thank you for sending that. Do you guys have any questions for Ray? Feel free to send them in. Okay, Jared is asking, will this presentation be shared? Thank you, Jared, for asking that because that's something I failed to communicate earlier. Absolutely, this presentation will be shared. We'll have it out to anyone who registered within the next 24 to 48 hours. Okay, Ahmed Omar asks, can I build my own task using iClicker? Ray. Oh, you're muted.
So without a little bit more context on what do you mean by task, I do find that with iClicker, especially if you're using the poll function, that for most of the forms of the polls that are available, which are short answer, numbers, targeting, and multiple choice, that any kind of game or design can really be built out using those. And if you're using Reef in particular, which means your students are using the mobile or web-based app, I love using targets to get the beginning of games going. Um, so as far as how to use iClicker for that, that might be a bigger conversation on what kind of task or game you're trying to build out. But I do find that, especially if you're using this idea of using iClicker to launch the game or to keep guiding it through, where if you're going to have them do step 1 to step 2 to step 3, having them submit iClicker along each step of the way is what will get them there.
Okay, that was a great question. Great answer. Another question from Jared Ray about how many games do you have in your classes in a week?
On average, I tend to have about one game a week, and it's me kind of playing with the medium right now. I found that sometimes students love them, and sometimes they absolutely do not. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with the game itself, but how attenuated they are to the readings or the content, and that they just want to deal with it a little bit less or not. But I do find, even if they don't love it in the moment, I've gotten from their course reflections, which is a big part of my pedagogy, that they understood it and they learned from it. So even if they don't necessarily like the game, it gets them there. And that's a win on my part.
That's a great question. Great answer. Okay, another question. Um, do you find it more effective in smaller classes or larger classes, or is it the same?
I have found that for scaling, it's much easier to get it done in classes about less than 50 students. Um, and as far as like what kind of games I do, it's much more difficult to build them out when I have that classroom of 150. That being said, I still try to find ways to incorporate them. It just might be a much smaller activity. So the ones that I showed for this one were mostly the cultural games, where I've been gifted that in cultural anthropology, my classes have been fairly small. But in my biological anthropology classes, we average at least 100 students. And with that being said, I've built out games that were more, maybe not a little bit less thoughtful, but a little bit more towards, how did you finish, what did you get out of the reading and what can you build upon it? And especially those games where you're trying to find those connections, students love those. They want to win those no matter what. And even though you're emphasizing that there's no winner, they want to prove that they can make those connections. And even in a huge class, it still works. It's not the best, but it still works.
Okay. All right. Any more questions? Feel free to send them through. If not, I will just go ahead and say thank you, Ray. Thank you for taking your time to share with us, and thank you for everyone who attended. Um, and actually, sorry, we have another question coming through. Okay, great. Does iClicker support answers using phones from students or just using the hardware? Ray, if you want to address that, then I can add on to it if you'd like.
Absolutely. So depending on what you're using, the iClicker cloud system um, allows both for the hardware and for cloud app-based programs. So for example, almost in all my classes, I require that students use the iClicker Reef app, which is what students access to participate in all the activities, and it allows them to get a little bit more, I think, than just the remotes and the hardware. For example, with a short answer response using the remotes, you're limited to 16 characters, and it's clunky because it's essentially just up or down arrows. But with the Reef app, they can have up to, I believe, 140 characters, which it's the length of an old style tweet, but students can put an entire paragraph with 140 characters when they know there's a limit. The other thing that the app does that they don't believe that the remotes are able to do are targeting questions, which I absolutely love. So, for example, if I had this slide and I could use a targeting question to say, choose your favorite objective. They could use, they would get a screen capture on their phone. They could just tap what they like and it would submit and that's their answer. And I do this for maps, I do this for readings, I do this for which word do you like the best? And for some reason, it actually works so incredibly well.
That's great. Yeah, we get feedback that people love target questions. And just to add on to what Ray said, the mobile app, you can ask 140 word character short answer questions, target questions, numeric and multiple choice. With our remotes, which you can use both in the same classroom or either or if you want only mobile or only remotes, we offer all three options. For remotes, you can do some short answer and multiple choice and numeric. So hopefully that answers that for you. In the follow-up that we'll send with the recording, we'll have a link to learn more about iClicker or sign up for a demo. So if anyone wants to see this in action, those demos are super quick and targeted towards what you want to see. So we'd love to have you on those to see a little bit more. Okay. Well, thank you again so much, Ray. And I will wrap this up and everyone be on the lookout for the recording in the next couple of days. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Ray.
Thank you.